Victoria Brennan had learned to wear perfection like armor. Custom-made outfits tailored exclusively for her, naturally, because she could afford it. A smile always measured and controlled, and a penthouse office where even the silence reeked of money. She had everything except the one thing her mother's voice reminded her of every Sunday. Someone to stand beside her when the champagne was poured and the questions began. The wedding invitation sat on her desk for 3 weeks, cream-colored and accusing, until she did something she'd never done before. She hired a stranger to pretend to love her. His name was Daniel Foster, and he arrived at their first meeting with kind eyes and a drawing his daughter had made folded in his wallet, introducing himself as just an ordinary man navigating through life. Nothing remarkable except for the fact that he was devastatingly handsome. She didn't know that the truth he was hiding would explode at the worst possible moment in front of everyone who mattered. She didn't know that by the time the groom raised his glass and said, "Oh, hello, boss. You're my wife's sister's boyfriend?" Her heart would already be too far gone to pull back. Sometimes the lies we tell to protect ourselves become the very thing that breaks us. The coffee in Victoria's office had gone cold an hour ago, but she kept the cup between her palms anyway, feeling the ceramic cool against her skin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched below like a kingdom she'd conquered one deal at a time, each building a testament to ambition that had cost her sleep, relationships, and the kind of normal life her sister Sophie seemed to collect effortlessly. The wedding invitation mocked her from its position on the mahogany desk, embossed lettering announcing Sophie's happily ever after, while Victoria's own life remained stubbornly singular. Her mother had called that morning, as she did every Sunday, and the conversation had followed its usual script: health, weather, work, and then the pause before the question that always came. "Are you bringing anyone to the wedding, dear?" Victoria had lied. The words had tumbled out before she could stop them. Something about a boyfriend she'd been seeing. Someone special. "Yes, Mother. You'll meet him at the wedding." She'd hung up feeling like she was 17 again, making up stories to fit in. Except now, the stories required more elaborate staging. That's how she found herself scrolling through a website that promised professional companion services for social events, the kind of thing she'd have laughed at 6 months ago. But 6 months ago, she hadn't been facing a 3-day wedding celebration where she'd be the only Brennan without a +1, where every aunt and cousin would ask the same pitying questions, where her success would somehow feel like failure because she was arriving alone. The agency sent her 3 profiles. She deleted the first 2 without reading past the opening lines. Too polished, too obviously hired, the kind of men who looked good in photographs but couldn't hold a real conversation. The 3rd profile made her pause. Daniel Foster, 38. Described himself as just trying to figure out this whole life thing one day at a time. The photo showed a man with dark hair going silver at the temples, eyes that seemed to hold some private joke, and a smile that didn't quite reach full confidence. He wasn't model handsome, but there was something real about him, something that made her think he might be able to pull off boyfriend without making it obvious he was being paid for it. She clicked request meeting before she could change her mind. They met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood she never visited, neutral territory where no one would recognize her. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a black coffee she didn't want, and took a table near the back where she could watch the door. She dressed down, jeans and a cashmere sweater instead of her usual armor of designer suits, but she still felt overdressed when Daniel walked in, wearing a jacket that had seen better days and carrying a worn leather bag that looked like it had traveled half the country. He spotted her immediately, raised a hand in greeting, and crossed the room with the kind of easy confidence that didn't come from money, but from something deeper, something earned. "Victoria." His voice matched his appearance, warm, a little rough around the edges, the kind of voice that could belong to a favorite teacher or a trusted friend. He slid into the seat across from her and set his bag on the floor with care. like it contained something precious. I have to admit, when I signed up for this, I didn't think anyone would actually want to hire me. I'm not exactly. He gestured at himself with a self-deprecating smile. You know, whatever people usually hire for these things. Victoria found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. I need someone real, she said, surprising herself with the honesty. My sister's getting married in 2 weeks, and I made the mistake of telling my mother I was bringing someone. 3 days of wedding events, family dinners, the whole production. I just need someone who can play the part convincingly enough that my mother stops looking at me like I'm some tragic spinster CEO who chose boardrooms over babies. She winced at the bitterness in her own voice. Sorry, that came out harsher than I meant. Daniel's expression shifted, something like understanding crossing his features. No, I get it. The expectations thing. People thinking they know what your life should look like because they can see what it doesn't have. He pulled out his wallet, extracted a small piece of paper folded in quarters, and smoothed it on the table between them. It was a child's drawing, all bright colors and enthusiastic lines, showing what appeared to be a man and a small girl holding hands under a rainbow. My daughter Claire drew this last week. She's 8. And every time someone asks me about dating or finding her a new mom, I want to show them this and say, this is enough. We're enough, just the 2 of us. But apparently, being a single dad means everyone thinks there's something missing in your life that needs fixing. Victoria stared at the drawing, feeling something twist in her chest. She'd expected this to be transactional, businesslike, a simple exchange of money for a service rendered. She hadn't expected to see pieces of her own loneliness reflected back at her in a coffee-stained drawing by a child she'd never met. You signed up for this because you needed an excuse to avoid the dating pressure? She asked. Something like that, Daniel admitted, folding the drawing back up with careful hands. I run a small design firm, nothing fancy, just me and a team of about 20 people. I'm a department manager, basically. And the thing about being a single dad in that world is everyone wants to set you up with their sister, or their friend, or their hairdresser. They mean well, but they don't understand that I'm not looking for someone to complete some picture of what my life should be. Claire and I, we've got our rhythm. We're good. He met her eyes, and there was something defiant in his gaze, something that said he'd defend this small good life against anyone who tried to tell him it wasn't enough. So when I saw this service, I thought, maybe I can use it the same way you are. Show up to a few work events with someone on my arm, get people to stop trying to fix what isn't broken. Victoria felt a strange kinship forming, the kind she never experienced in boardrooms or at charity galas, where everyone performed their success like a rehearsed dance. So we're both using this to avoid the well-meaning intrusion of people who think they know what's best for us, she said slowly. That's actually kind of perfect. They spent the next hour working out the details. Daniel would be her boyfriend for the 3-day wedding celebration. Victoria would pay him $5,000, enough to be worth his time, but not so much that it felt transactional in a way that made her uncomfortable. They'd need to meet a few times before the wedding to get their story straight, learn enough about each other to make it convincing. Victoria found herself offering more than she'd planned. Dinner next week, maybe a walk through the park to practice looking couple-like, whatever it took to make this believable. Daniel agreed to all of it with the same easy manner he'd brought to their first meeting, like he was doing her a favor rather than taking her money. As they stood to leave, Daniel hesitated, his hand on the back of his chair. Just so you know, he said, I'm not great at lying. I mean, I can do it for this, for a specific purpose. But I'm going to tell you the truth about most things, because I'm terrible at keeping track of made-up stories. So if I seem too honest or too real, that's why. It's just easier for me to be myself and make up as little as possible. Victoria nodded, appreciating the warning even as she wondered what truths he might be holding back. "Fair enough," she said. "I'll try to do the same." They parted ways outside the coffee shop, and Victoria walked back to her car, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had a solution to her mother's questions, a buffer against the pitying looks she'd been dreading. She didn't let herself think about the drawing folded in Daniel's wallet, or the way his voice had gone soft when he talked about his daughter, or the fact that for the first time in months, she'd had a conversation that felt real instead of performative. This was business, she reminded herself. A transaction. Nothing more. The following week, they met for dinner at a quiet restaurant in a part of town where Victoria wouldn't run into anyone she knew. Daniel arrived 15 minutes late, apologetic and slightly rumpled, explaining that Claire's babysitter had been delayed and he'd had to wait until his neighbor could take over. Victoria found herself asking about Claire instead of being annoyed by the tardiness, and Daniel's face transformed as he talked about his daughter. The way she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because she liked the surprise each morning, how she'd decided to become a paleontologist after watching a documentary about dinosaurs, the elaborate bedtime stories they made up together, where Claire was always the hero who saved the day. "You're really close with her," Victoria observed, watching the way his whole demeanor changed when he spoke about his daughter. It wasn't something she saw often in her world, where children were scheduled activities and accomplishments to be mentioned at dinner parties. "She's my person," Daniel said simply. Her mom left when Claire was 2, just decided motherhood wasn't what she wanted and walked away. It was just the 2 of us for a while, and then it kept being just the 2 of us. And somewhere along the way, I realized we didn't need anyone else to be whole. We're a team. She knows she can count on me, and I know she's the best thing I ever did with my life, even on the days when she refuses to eat anything but peanut butter sandwiches and insists dinosaurs are hiding in her closet. Victoria felt something shift inside her, a recognition of a kind of love she'd never experienced, unconditional, uncomplicated, not tied to performance or achievement. "That sounds nice," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. They practiced their cover story over pasta and wine. They'd met 6 months ago at a charity art auction, bonded over a mutual appreciation for modern sculpture, started with coffee dates that turned into dinners that turned into something real. Daniel would be vague about his work, just a manager at a design firm, nothing worth discussing in detail. Victoria would be honest about hers, because lying about being a CEO seemed pointless when a simple internet search would reveal everything. They'd keep it simple, keep it believable, keep it close enough to truth that the lies wouldn't trip them up. "What about physical stuff?" Daniel asked, his ears going slightly pink. "I mean, couples touch, hold hands, that kind of thing. We should probably practice so it doesn't look awkward." Victoria's first instinct was to dismiss it as unnecessary, but she forced herself to be practical. "You're right," she said, and reached across the table to take his hand. His palm was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who built things instead of just signing off on them. They sat like that for a moment, fingers intertwined, and Victoria tried to ignore the fact that it felt more real than any of the actual relationships she'd had in the past 5 years. "See? Not awkward," she lied. Daniel smiled, but there was something uncertain in his eyes. Like he was aware they were crossing some invisible line from transaction into territory neither of them had mapped out. "Not awkward," he agreed, and squeezed her hand once before letting go. They met twice more before the wedding. Once for a walk through the park where Daniel told her stories about Claire's latest obsession with collecting interesting rocks, and Victoria found herself laughing at the image of a grown man carrying pebbles in his pockets because his daughter declared them scientifically important. Once for coffee, where they ran into Daniel's daughter entirely by accident, Claire and her babysitter getting hot chocolate at the same cafe where Victoria and Daniel had arranged to meet. Victoria watched as Daniel's whole face lit up at the sight of his daughter. Watched as he crouched down to Claire's level and listened with complete attention as she explained the difference between sedimentary and igneous rocks with the seriousness of a professor delivering a lecture. Claire turned to Victoria with the bold curiosity of childhood. "Are you my dad's friend?" she asked, and Victoria found herself nodding before she could think about what she was agreeing to. "You're pretty," Claire announced, with the matter-of-fact honesty of 8-year-olds. "Do you like rocks? I found a really good one yesterday. It might be from space." "I don't know much about rocks," Victoria admitted, "but I'd love to hear about your space rock." She spent the next 10 minutes listening to Claire's enthusiastic explanation of meteorites, watching the way Daniel's hand rested protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The way Claire leaned into him with complete trust. Something in Victoria's chest tightened and loosened at the same time, a feeling she couldn't name, but that stayed with her long after they'd said goodbye, and she'd returned to her empty penthouse with its perfect silence and its cold coffee cups. The wedding weekend arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed specifically for celebrations. Victoria packed her bags with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, choosing outfits that would satisfy her mother's standards without making her feel like she was wearing a costume. Daniel was meeting her at the hotel, a sprawling resort 2 hours outside the city, where Sophie and Ryan had rented out an entire wing for their 3-day celebration. Victoria drove alone, her phone full of encouraging texts from Daniel about how they'd get through this together, and tried not to think about the fact that she was looking forward to seeing him in a way that had nothing to do with the service he was providing. Daniel was waiting in the hotel lobby when she arrived, looking uncomfortable in a new suit that had clearly been purchased specifically for this occasion. He stood when he saw her, and his smile was genuine, even though his eyes held the same nervousness she felt churning in her own stomach. "Ready for this?" he asked, taking her bag before she could protest. "As ready as I'll ever be," Victoria said, and let him take her hand as they walked toward the check-in desk. His palm was warm against hers, steady, and she found herself gripping a little tighter than necessary, as if he were an anchor in waters she'd been navigating alone for too long. The first event was a welcome dinner that evening, immediate family only, which meant Victoria's parents, Sophie and Ryan, and a handful of aunts and uncles who'd traveled for the celebration. Victoria's mother, Margaret Brennan, descended on them the moment they entered the private dining room, her eyes cataloging Daniel from head to toe with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating people based on their net worth and social connections. "So this is the mysterious boyfriend," Margaret said, her smile perfectly calibrated between warmth and skepticism. "Victoria's told us so little about you, Daniel. What is it you do?" Daniel handled it better than Victoria expected, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that looked natural enough to be real. "I manage a design team," he said easily. "Nothing as impressive as what Victoria does, but I enjoy the work. Keeps me busy, and it means I get to solve interesting problems every day." He shifted the conversation smoothly, asking Margaret about the wedding preparations, complimenting the venue, playing the role of interested boyfriend with a skill that made Victoria wonder how much of it was acting and how much was just Daniel being himself. Dinner was a blur of small talk and careful navigation. Sophie caught Victoria's eye across the table and smiled, genuine happiness radiating from her in a way that made Victoria feel both protective and envious. Her little sister had found something real with Ryan, something that didn't require performance or pretense, and Victoria was happy for her even as she felt the weight of her own carefully constructed fiction sitting heavy in her chest. Ryan himself was quieter than Victoria expected, attentive to Sophie, but watchful in a way that made Victoria think he noticed more than he let on. When Daniel asked him about his work, Ryan's answer was careful, mentioning the design firm he worked for, but not elaborating, and Victoria filed away the oddness of it without examining it too closely. That night, in the hotel room they were sharing for appearance's sake. 2 beds, very professional, Daniel had insisted. Victoria found herself unable to sleep. Daniel was reading by the light of his phone, and after half an hour of staring at the ceiling, Victoria broke the silence. "Thank you," she said into the darkness, "for doing this, for being convincing. My mother actually seemed to like you, which is not something I expected." Daniel set his phone down and turned to look at her, his face half-shadowed in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "Your family isn't as scary as you made them sound," he said gently. "Your mom's just worried about you. She wants you to be happy." "She wants me to be married," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference." "Maybe," Daniel acknowledged, "but I don't think she's wrong to worry. You seem lonely, Victoria, even surrounded by people, especially then." The observation stung because it was true. Victoria rolled onto her side, facing away from him, and pretended she was falling asleep when really she was just trying to hide the fact that his words had found their mark. Behind her, she heard Daniel sigh softly, and then the room fell silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant sound of music from someone's late-night celebration drifting through the walls. The next day was packed with activities: a golf outing for those who wanted it, a spa day for others, and an evening rehearsal dinner that required formal attire and endless toasts. Victoria and Daniel navigated it all together, and somewhere in the performance, something shifted. His hand on her waist started to feel less like an act, and more like something she'd been missing without knowing it. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, instead of just waiting for his turn to speak, made her feel seen in a way her actual relationships had never managed. They were playing pretend, but the emotions creeping in around the edges were becoming uncomfortably real. It was during the rehearsal dinner that things began to unravel. Ryan stood to make a toast, champagne glass in hand, and as he spoke about love and partnership and finding the person who makes you whole, his eyes swept the room and landed on Daniel. Something flickered across Ryan's face: recognition, surprise, confusion. And then he was raising his glass higher and saying, "I also want to thank everyone here for supporting us, including my boss Daniel Foster, who's apparently full of surprises I didn't know about." The room went quiet for a beat too long. Victoria felt Daniel go rigid beside her, felt the moment stretch and fracture as Sophie looked confused, as Margaret's eyebrows rose in question, as Ryan's words hung in the air like an accusation. "Boss?" Victoria heard herself say, her voice coming from very far away. "What does he mean, boss?" Daniel's face had gone pale. He set down his champagne glass with careful precision, like he was buying himself time to find words that wouldn't exist. "Victoria," he started, but Ryan was already continuing, oblivious to the grenade he'd just thrown into the center of the celebration. "Daniel's the CEO of Foster Design," Ryan said, his tone caught between professional respect and personal confusion. "I've worked there for 3 years. I had no idea you two were dating, sir. Sophie never mentioned." He stopped, finally reading the room, finally seeing the way Victoria had pushed back from the table, the way Daniel had gone completely still, the way the air had turned sharp with betrayal and confusion. Victoria stood, her chair scraping against the floor, loud in the sudden silence. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice surprisingly steady, considering the way her heart was trying to break through her ribs. She walked out of the dining room with her head high, her mother's voice calling after her, Sophie's distressed, "What's happening?" following her into the hallway. She made it to the garden before her legs gave out, before she had to grip the stone wall surrounding the fountain just to stay upright. Daniel found her there 5 minutes later. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path, knew it was him before he spoke. "Victoria, please let me explain," he said, and she could hear the desperation in his voice. the fear of losing something he hadn't even known he wanted until it was slipping away. She turned to face him, and she could feel tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "You lied to me," she said flatly. "You're not some department manager struggling to make ends meet. You're a CEO. You employ Ryan. You've been lying this entire time." "I didn't lie about the important things," Daniel said, taking a step closer. "I'm a single dad. I do have Claire. Everything I told you about my life, about what I want, about why I signed up for that service, all of that was true. I downplayed my job because I wanted you to see me as a person instead of another successful guy with money and a title. I wanted to be evaluated on who I am, not what I have." "That's not your decision to make," Victoria shot back, her voice rising despite her attempts to stay calm. "You don't get to decide what information I need to make choices about my own life. You don't get to manipulate the situation by hiding things and then claim it was for my own good." She laughed, a bitter sound that hurt her throat. "God, I'm such an idiot. I thought maybe this could be something real. I thought maybe I'd finally met someone who saw me instead of my bank account and my company. But you were doing the exact same thing I was, performing a version of yourself that you thought would be more palatable." "It wasn't like that," Daniel said, and she could hear the rawness in his voice, the genuine pain. "Yes, I hid my job title. But everything else was real, Victoria. The way I feel when I'm with you, the conversations we've had, the fact that you make me laugh in a way I haven't laughed in years, none of that was an act. I should have told you the truth about my job, and I'm sorry I didn't. But please, don't dismiss everything we've built because I made one mistake." "One mistake?" Victoria's voice cracked. "You built our entire relationship on that mistake. How am I supposed to trust anything else you've said? How do I know what's real and what's just another convenient omission?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. "I hired you to pretend to be my boyfriend, and you were so good at it that I forgot it was pretend. But that's on me. I let myself believe in something that was never real to begin with." "It was real," Daniel insisted, stepping close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes. "Maybe it started as pretend, but somewhere along the way, it became the most real thing in my life. I fell for you, Victoria. Not the CEO, not the woman who hired me, but you, the person who listened to Claire talk about rocks like it was the most important conversation in the world, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who let me see past the armor you wear to the person underneath, who's just as scared of being hurt as I am." Victoria shook her head, backing away from him. "Don't do this. Don't make this about feelings and connection when you were lying to me the whole time. If you really cared, you would have told me the truth before we got here. You would have given me the choice." "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "I should have. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. But I'm telling you now, everything between us is real for me. The question is whether it was ever real for you, or if I was always just a convenient solution to your family problem." The accusation hit harder than Victoria expected, because there was truth in it. She'd hired him for exactly that reason. She'd used him the same way he'd used the lie about his job, as protection, as a buffer against judgment and expectation. "That's not fair," she whispered. "No," Daniel agreed. "But it's true. We both came into this looking for something fake that would solve a real problem. The only difference is I fell in love along the way, and I don't think you're ready to admit you did too." Victoria felt something break inside her chest, sharp and clean and painful. "Don't," she said, her voice barely audible. "Don't say you love me. Not now. Not when I can't trust if it's true or just another part of the performance." Daniel's face crumpled, and for a moment she thought he might cry. Instead, he nodded slowly and took a step back. "I'll leave," he said. I'll tell your family there was an emergency with Claire. Make it easy for you. But Victoria, when you're ready to stop being angry and start being honest with yourself about what this is, I'll be waiting. Because I meant what I said. This is real for me, even if it started as something else." He turned and walked back toward the hotel, leaving Victoria alone in the garden, with the sound of the fountain and the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on her shoulders. She sank onto the stone bench and finally let the tears come, crying for the relationship that had never been real, for the one that might have been, and for the fact that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. By the time she made it back to the hotel room, Daniel's things were gone. There was a note on the pillow of his bed, written in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the contract they'd signed what felt like a lifetime ago. "I'm sorry for everything, but mostly for making you doubt something that was true." She crumpled the note in her fist and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty space where he'd been, and trying to convince herself that this hollow feeling was relief instead of loss. The wedding the next day was beautiful in the way expensive things always are. Perfect flowers, perfect weather, perfect vows spoken by her perfect sister to her perfect fiancé. Victoria sat through it in a dress that cost more than most people's rent and smiled at all the right moments, and no one except Sophie seemed to notice that she was breaking apart inside. Her mother had accepted Daniel's excuse about a family emergency with the kind of disappointment Victoria had learned to expect, and the weekend continued its carefully choreographed celebration as if nothing had fractured beneath the surface. It was only later, back in her penthouse with its expensive silence and its cold coffee cups, that Victoria let herself think about what she'd lost. She pulled out her phone a dozen times, typed messages to Daniel that she never sent, deleted his number, and then restored it from a backup because she couldn't quite let go. A week passed, then 2, and the ache didn't fade the way she expected it to. Instead, it settled into her bones like an old injury, a reminder that she'd had something real and chosen safety over truth, protection over possibility. Sophie called 3 weeks after the wedding, her voice bright with newlywed happiness and concern for her sister. "Ryan told me what happened," she said without preamble, about Daniel being his boss, about the whole mess. She paused, and Victoria could hear the careful way she was choosing her words. "He also told me that Daniel's been miserable since the wedding. Apparently he barely sleeps, barely eats, and he finally told Ryan the whole story because he needed someone to talk to. Ryan says he's never seen his boss like this, completely destroyed over a woman." Victoria's throat tightened. "Sophie." "No, listen," her sister interrupted gently. "I know you're hurt. I know he lied. But Vic, I watched you two together that weekend, and I saw something I've never seen in you before. You were happy. Really. Genuinely happy. Not just performing happiness for Mom and Dad. And yes, he made a mistake by not telling you about his job. But haven't you made mistakes? Haven't you hidden parts of yourself because you were scared of being judged or rejected or not enough?" Victoria closed her eyes and saw Daniel's face in the garden, the rawness in his expression when he'd said he loved her. "It's not the same," she said, but the conviction had gone out of her voice. "Isn't it?" Sophie asked. "You hired him to be fake because you were afraid of showing up alone. He pretended to be less successful because he was afraid of being valued for the wrong reasons. You were both protecting yourselves, and you both fell for each other anyway. That sounds pretty real to me." After they hung up, Victoria sat in her office and looked at the city spread below her, all those buildings and lives and people navigating their own complicated truths. She thought about Daniel's daughter with her pockets full of rocks, about the way his whole face transformed when he talked about Claire, about the drawing folded in his wallet like a talisman against loneliness. She thought about the way his hand had felt in hers, steady and warm and real. She found herself walking before she made a conscious decision to move, out of her office, down to the parking garage, into her car. She drove to the coffee shop where they'd first met, the one in the neighborhood she never visited, and sat at the same table in the back, where she'd waited for a stranger to show up and solve her problems. She ordered 2 coffees, black, and pulled out her phone. The text was simple. "I'm at our coffee shop. If you're willing to talk, I'm willing to listen." She didn't know if he'd come. She wouldn't blame him if he didn't. But she sat there with 2 cooling cups of coffee and something that might have been hope. And she waited. 20 minutes later, the door opened, and Daniel walked in with Claire holding his hand. He looked thinner than she remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with heartbreak. Claire spotted Victoria first and pulled on her father's arm, pointing with the enthusiasm of a child who doesn't understand adult complications. Daniel saw her and stopped, his whole body going still, like he was afraid to move in case she disappeared. Victoria stood slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Daniel said something to Claire, who nodded and went to the counter to order hot chocolate, giving them space with the kind of perceptiveness that surprised Victoria all over again. Then Daniel crossed the room, and they were standing face to face with a table between them and 3 weeks of silence hanging heavy in the air. "I'm sorry," Victoria said before he could speak, "for not trusting that what we had was real. For being so scared of being hurt that I didn't give you a chance to explain. For running instead of fighting for something that mattered." Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "I'm sorry too," he said, his voice rough, "for lying about my job, for not giving you all the information you needed to make real choices. For being so afraid that you'd only see the CEO and miss everything else that I hid the truth instead of trusting you with it." They stood there, and Victoria felt tears sliding down her cheeks without trying to stop them. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust someone enough to let them see all of me, the successful parts, and the lonely parts, and the scared parts. I don't know how to believe that someone could want me for reasons that have nothing to do with what I've accomplished or what I can provide." "I don't know how to do it either," Daniel said, and he was crying too, not bothering to wipe the tears away. "I don't know how to let someone in when I've built my whole life around being enough just as I am with Claire. I don't know how to make room for someone else without being terrified they'll leave like her mother did. But Victoria, I want to figure it out with you. I want to try." Claire appeared at Daniel's elbow, hot chocolate in hand, looking between them with the serious expression of a child trying to understand adult emotions. "Are you going to be friends again?" she asked Victoria directly. "Because Dad's been really sad, and I think it's because he misses you. He makes your coffee every morning and then doesn't drink it, which is weird." Victoria laughed through her tears and crouched down to Claire's level. "I've been sad too," she admitted, "because I miss your dad, and I miss hearing about your rocks. And I miss being part of your world even though I was only there for a little while." Claire considered this with the gravity of someone weighing important matters. "Do you like my dad?" she asked. "Like, really like him? Not just pretend." "Really like him," Victoria confirmed, looking up at Daniel as she said it. "No pretending." "Good," Claire said firmly, "because he really likes you too. He told Uncle Ryan that you make him feel like the world is bigger and better and full of possibilities, which I think means he loves you. That's what Uncle Ryan said anyway." Daniel made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Claire, buddy, maybe we should let the grown-ups talk without your commentary." But Victoria was standing, closing the distance between them. And then she was in Daniel's arms, and he was holding her like she was something precious and breakable and worth fighting for. They stood there in the middle of the coffee shop while Claire drank her hot chocolate and hummed to herself, while other customers moved around them, while the world continued spinning and they held on to each other like they were the only solid thing in it. "I love you," Victoria whispered against his shoulder. "I think I have since you showed me that drawing and I saw how much you love your daughter. I think I've been falling for you since our first conversation, and I've been too scared to admit it, even to myself." "I love you too," Daniel said, pulling back just enough to look at her face. "And I promise, no more lies, no more hiding, just us, figuring this out together, making mistakes and apologizing and trying again, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Victoria said, and kissed him in front of Claire and the coffee shop, and God and everyone. Kissed him like it was the start of something instead of the end, like they had all the time in the world to get it right. Claire made a disgusted noise. "Ooh, kissing!" But she was grinning when Victoria looked down at her, and when she held out her hand to show Victoria a rock she'd brought specifically for this occasion, Victoria took it like the gift it was. "This one's special," Claire explained. "It's for new beginnings. I found it yesterday, and I've been saving it for when you and Dad stopped being silly and started being happy again." Victoria closed her fingers around the small stone, smooth and ordinary and perfect. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for more than just the rock. "I'll keep it safe." They sat together at the table, the three of them, drinking coffee and hot chocolate, and talking about dinosaurs and design projects and wedding disasters. Daniel's hand found Victoria's under the table, their fingers intertwining with the kind of ease that comes from choosing each other over and over, from deciding that real is better than perfect. The truth is worth the risk of being hurt. Later, when Claire had gone to wash chocolate off her hands, and they had a moment alone, Daniel leaned close and said quietly, "I should probably tell you. I talked to Ryan. He knows the whole story now. And he wanted me to tell you that he's sorry for how it came out at the dinner. He didn't know we were trying to keep my job quiet. And he feels terrible about the whole thing." Victoria shook her head. "It's not his fault. If anything, I'm grateful. Because if he hadn't said something, we might have kept pretending, and I might have missed out on this. On you, on Claire, on whatever this is we're building together. A relationship," Daniel said with a small smile. "I think that's what this is called. A real one, with all the mess and complications and terrifying vulnerability that comes with it. I'm not very good at those," Victoria admitted. "I tend to treat them like business deals, all negotiations and compromises and strategic planning." "Lucky for you," Daniel said, kissing her forehead gently. "I'm not very good at them either. So we can be bad at it together and figure it out as we go." Claire returned and announced she was ready to show Victoria her entire rock collection, which apparently required a trip to Daniel's house right now, immediately. Daniel looked at Victoria with a question in his eyes, and she found herself nodding, following them out into the afternoon sunshine, climbing into Daniel's car with its child seat in the back and its worn upholstery and its collection of Claire's treasures scattered across every surface. They drove to a house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing like Victoria's penthouse, but warm in a way her carefully designed space had never managed. Claire dragged her upstairs to a bedroom painted purple with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and showed her boxes and boxes of rocks, each one catalogued with the kind of attention to detail that made Victoria think Claire might actually become that paleontologist she dreamed of being. Daniel made dinner while they examined specimens, and when he called them down to eat, Victoria sat at a kitchen table that had definitely seen better days and ate spaghetti with sauce from a jar and felt more at home than she had in any five-star restaurant. After dinner, after Claire had been tucked into bed with promises that Victoria would come back soon to see the new rocks she was definitely going to find, Daniel and Victoria sat on the back porch and watched the stars come out. "This is going to be complicated," Victoria said quietly. "My work, your work, Claire, my mother's opinions, figuring out how to blend our lives when they're so different. Probably, Daniel agreed. But I think complicated is okay as long as we're honest with each other, as long as we choose to show up and do the work even when it's hard. Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him, the realness of this moment. I can do honest, she said. I think, with practice. Me too, Daniel said, and they sat there in the darkness, two people who'd started with lies and found their way to something true, who'd been looking for escape from loneliness and found instead a reason to stop running. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. And real, Victoria was learning, was worth every risk, every vulnerability, every terrifying moment of letting someone see you completely and choosing to believe they might stay anyway. Months later, at Sophie and Ryan's first anniversary party, Margaret Brennan cornered Victoria in the garden and said, I have to admit, when you first introduced us to Daniel, I had my doubts. But seeing you two together now, I've never seen you happier, darling. He's good for you. She paused, then added with the kind of maternal knowing that both comforted and terrified Victoria. And you're good for him too. Good for each other. That's what matters. Victoria looked across the lawn to where Daniel was helping Claire chase fireflies, both of them laughing at something she couldn't hear, and felt her heart do that thing it had been doing more and more lately, expanding to make room for more love than she'd thought herself capable of holding. Yeah, she said softly. We are. Sophie appeared at her elbow, champagne in hand, grinning with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instincts had been vindicated even though she'd had nothing to do with it. So, she said, when's your wedding? Because I have some thoughts on venues, and Claire already told me she wants to be flower girl and carry rocks instead of rose petals, which I think is perfect. Victoria laughed and didn't correct her sister's assumption that marriage was inevitable. Because maybe it was. Maybe this thing that had started as pretend and become real was heading toward forever, toward vows spoken without any performance, toward choosing each other every day with full knowledge of all the flaws and fears and beautiful imperfections they each carried. Maybe love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone real and deciding they were worth the risk. Daniel caught her eye from across the lawn and smiled, and Victoria smiled back, and in that moment, she understood what all the poets and songwriters had been trying to say all along, that love wasn't armor or protection or a solution to loneliness. It was choosing to be vulnerable, to be seen, to let someone else's happiness matter as much as your own. It was complicated and terrifying and absolutely worth it. Claire ran over with a jar full of fireflies and an explanation about bioluminescence that she'd clearly gotten from her latest documentary obsession. Victoria listened with the kind of attention that had become second nature, asking questions, admiring the captured light, feeling grateful for this small, brilliant person who'd led her father into a coffee shop and changed everything. When Claire finally released the fireflies back into the night and took off after them with renewed enthusiasm, Daniel slipped his arm around Victoria's waist and pulled her close. Happy? He asked. And it was the same question he asked her almost every day, like he needed to make sure this was still real, still good, still what she wanted. Victoria turned in his arms and kissed him under the stars and the string lights and the released fireflies rising into the darkness. Happy, she confirmed, and meant it with every piece of her carefully guarded, previously protected, now completely exposed heart. So happy. And she was.